Welcome to Accelerate. So we have Allan MacDonald joining us today. Allan, you spent 15 years in elite sport, then moved into government and have been doing your doctorate in decision making. That's not an obvious trajectory for a career. What pulled you towards studying decisions rather than, I suppose, making them in different organisations?
Yeah, so first of all, thanks very much for inviting me on, and getting to speak about decision making is something I'm really passionate about. So I appreciate the opportunity to share some of the learnings that I've got with everyone else. But yeah, it wasn't an obvious transition for me. I was working in professional sport, and I was really finding myself getting, exposure to situations and decisions that I was really struggling with, and I didn't feel that I was equipped to be making those decisions. So I reached out to Dr. John Kiley and sort of spoke through some of the challenges I was having with him. And I originally decided to study leadership, kind of with strategy as well, so related to your area. And from there, from working through it, I found decision making as a really interesting area, because conventionally we believe that experience is what drives decision making. But then as I started getting under the bonnet of some of the research, I started realizing that decision making, like lots of other things, is a skill, and if you deliberately practice it, you could improve it. And then I found that really interesting, and then I decided to take a little bit of a side swerve in my career to see if I could apply some of the performance knowledge that I had into government. And it turns out to have been a good career choice for lots of reasons, but particularly for decision making, because there's massive high stakes decisions that we end up having to make in government. So I think I've been really lucky with that one.
I think what you've talked about there is the transferability, I suppose, of some of these skills that aren't naturally only siloed into kind of sport as an environment. But as you also alluded to, there is this assumption, and it's probably not just in sport. I would assume it's probably across all organisations, that the more experienced you become, the more educated you are, the better your decisions are. But that's not necessarily what your work and the research shows. So what is that gap that exists?
Yeah, so you're right that experience can be useful in certain situations, but I think the gap for us, particularly within the world of performance sport, is that we make decisions all the time. So we assume that because we're doing it, we're getting better at it, and that we assume that experience is what drives increased performance. But there's a whole spectrum of decisions that we're making. People use different frameworks to try to sort of categorize these decisions. There's one called the Cynefin framework. It's really quite good at sort of segmenting things into 4 or 5 different categories. But experience is good for certain types of decisions. But for most of the decisions that we're making in sport, experience probably, it can be a negative, because it allows us to be selective in the information that we recall. We tend to remember the situations that have gone really well for us, and then we think that the decisions that we made in those situations should then be repeated, when in reality the conditions that made that decision successful, when we then move forward, the conditions are completely different in the world that we're dealing with. It'll be different athlete, different team, different pressures, different stakes, all these sort of things, but yet we roll out the same sort of solution. So I think experience can be useful, but it's when we deploy that experience. And I think specifically in sport, where the gap sits is, well, one, people tend to think experience lets you be a better decision maker. Two, most of us, and my research confirms this, we don't receive formal training in decision making, which is kind of bonkers when we think about it, because we're making decisions all the time, and particularly those of us that work in pro sports or work with pro sports, you're making decisions on $100 million athletes, but you've not received any formal training how to do this. So there's a bit of a disconnect. And then some of the research that I've done in my doctorate, we ask people how they improve their technical skills and the methods that people use to improve their technical skills. So doing technical specific training, going to conferences, going to workshops, engaging with the scientific literature. When we then ask, okay, how do you improve your decision making? None of those things are really engaged with. It just comes back down to experience. And then when you ask, okay, so what's that experience given you? It helps people be better communicators, or at least they feel they're better communicators. They feel they build better relationships. And all of these things are kind of on the periphery, but none of them, or very few people will say, oh, I've engaged with the decision-making literature. I've started deliberately practicing my decision-making. Those things are just not done. So it is kind of a bit nuts when we think about it. There's this like disconnect, but it's one that hopefully that gap is what I'm trying to solve with my research.
Brilliant. And it's so true. We talk about them as like, well, they're commonly referred to, I suppose, as soft skills. I think they're much more powerful than that, but they're not sexy. They're not like, people will learn what, especially in like our background world of kind of physio and S&C, they'll learn what the next best exercise is or the next new piece of kind of technology is, but it's not as sexy to talk about kind of communication and decision making, but it underpins, it's the absolute foundation of everything we do. And as you like alluded to, I come at it from I suppose my physio background, but also that strategy piece of we think strategy is a plan or something that like has to be put in place, but it is, but the sequence of decisions that happen either to formulate that or actually to then execute it is going to basically tell you what the performance outcome is going to be. So when it comes to decision quality, like, do you think of it from that kind of strategic aspect? Do you silo it into what's being done in one particular environment, or do you see that kind of transferability across either decisions, organizations, different layers of an organization? How do you formulate it within your head?
Yeah, that's a great question. I probably, and to be honest, still working through this, because it's like decision making is an enormous area, and I have been down I'd say every rabbit hole, but every couple of months you discover 100 new ones. But you've got this huge continuum of decision making, so I'm trying to make this sort of like really worthwhile for the people that are listening, that they've maybe not engaged with decision making before, but you have this huge continuum of sort of cognitive decision making that maybe people have heard of, Daniel Kahneman, and like cognitive decision making around thinking fast and thinking slow and heuristics and biases. And then at kind of the other end, you have this really mathematical, like optimization approach, which companies like Amazon and Apple are having to make these really huge sequential decisions around, where they build, where they source raw materials for manufacturing, where they locate the plants, the assembly plants, things around their supply chain, things come into around tax jurisdictions. It's really complex. You've got this huge continuum. So, but within that, there's definitely key principles, and there's some really good research that shows that really no matter what domain you're in, what you're trying to make decisions in, there's definitely a list of good practice things that if you start implementing them, and a lot of them you can implement really quickly, inexpensively. So for example, there was a fantastic piece of research that a lot of the work we've done has been built around by a professor called Philip Tetlock. So he did some work originally in, funny because it's the world I kind of live a little bit in now, but in politics, and then pulled that into geopolitics, where he essentially got experts to make forecasts, and this is a point I'll pick up on later, but forecasts are really closely linked to decision making, but make forecasts in their area of expertise about things that they would expect to happen, and then later on tracked those back and scored if the experts were correct or not. And it turned out that they were pretty poor. They were essentially like random flip up off a coin, which was not very promising then for us as experts. And when I sort of first got introduced to this, well, first of all, it was a big hit to my ego, because I was 15 years in sport. I thought that, well, I'm experienced, I make good decisions, but this research was kind of conflicting with that. But then in the next piece of work they did, they delivered some really simple sort of 10-12 minute decision making education hits to people, just going through some really general skills. And I want to emphasize this, not domain specific skills, so not the technical skills around that we would have in like physiotherapy or performance sport, but just general skills around how your thinking style, being open-minded, how you search for contradictory evidence, how you anchor decisions on what's called base rates. These common principles are building blocks of good decisions, and they found significant improvements for pretty much everybody who engaged with this sort of training. So we've sportified that now. We're applying it in the world of sport. But in my day job as a project manager working on a couple of fairly large projects, every day I use these decision making tools, like probably multiple times a day. And one of the big ones, which I'll cover later on, is around scoring. That the outcome's a really important thing at decisions, because ultimately, you if you're dealing with £100 million footballer and you decide to play them and they get broken, that's important. But the other bit is this process and how you evaluate the process. And this is something we're not really taught in sport or outside of sport, but there's common themes for how you do that.
Brilliant. And we'll unpick some of that. But I love that. I love that the research shows that it's like a flip of a coin and luck, because I relate it sometimes to like a business hat of like, sometimes they just say you're in the right place at the right time with the right product and you met the right person and suddenly you've got like a successful business. And there's an element of that probably to it, in that
Sure.
luck does come into it, but you also kind of, I do believe of that element of you make your own luck, like the preparation meets an opportunity and then someone like suddenly you're an overnight success, but no one sees all the bit that's happened behind the scenes on that. And I think that links to, you do have to prepare for this. You can put the mileage in, you can put the work in, similar to how you can with your technical skills. So when you see like a high performance environment or any organizational environment, what are some of the, like, I suppose, common decision making failures you see, but also what are the patterns that you see when things are going really well as well?
Yeah, so there's, and again, I hope this is like useful for the listeners of this. There's what the research shows, and then there's what we've seen. So we do a lot of work with different teams across, Premier League, NFL, NBA, quite a lot of US based sports. And one of the things we typically do with them is we ask, can we observe one of their key decision making meetings? So it might be an evening meeting around player availability. It might be a quick meeting in the morning in their environment where some monitoring data shows up and they need to make a decision whether to modify the player's trainer and whatnot. So our experience is really from observational analysis, that we're in the environment. This is what the research shows are the errors. Let's have a look at what we're seeing. So the most common one we see is this dominant person or dominant people. Usually one or two, well, they'll just lead the conversation. So you might have a performance meeting where there's between sort of 7 and 20. Some of the sports end up having a little bit more than 20 in the meeting. But just one or two figures will just dominate that conversation. Depending how confident they sound, other people will start agreeing with them. And really, we're not getting this diversity of input from different people. So that's a really common error, is a dominant person. And of course, we provide some strategies to try and mitigate against that. Another one that's really closely related is contamination. This is where, you might have one member of staff who's so much more experienced than everybody else. They either speak first or they speak to different people before the meeting. And because this person is so experienced, maybe a more junior member of staff will then shift their perspective to just agree with the most experienced person because they're really knowledgeable, they're usually right. And then what ends up happening is they don't bring important piece of information that they might have to the table because they look a bit, they feel like they might look a little bit silly. Another one we commonly see in this is, there's a couple of different things that drive this. Usually it's the language and the way that the meeting's set up, but it's consensus seeking. Consensus seeking is dreadful for decision making. It's something that we actually think is a good thing, or at least in the research I've done, people tend to think, oh, we want a consensus, but consensus can be absolutely disastrous for making effective decisions. And one of the ways that we see this is that we might frame a question as, does everybody agree with this, or is everybody happy with this? And then people end up nodding, depending when the time in the meeting is. Like some of these meetings go on later into the night after a long day's training. People just want a consensus to move on. So you definitely don't want a consensus. And again, there's certain strategies for how you can mitigate against consensus seeking. And then probably there's some fairly obvious ones, which, I mean, I see these so commonly, like every day on LinkedIn, around like data, and how we've got so much data now. We just have this massive overload, and is there really evidence that all of this additional data makes us better decision makers? There's maybe actually a lot of evidence that shows that too much data can cause us to be indecisive. It can cause us to be contradictory. But the other thing with data is that it creates this noisiness in your process. And what I mean by that is that, I think it was 2 or 3 weeks ago now, we observed a soccer team in one of these situations, and the doctor opened up the floor for a couple of different players they were discussing around. And different people came in with different pieces of data at different times. Some bits of data weren't discussed. One person, who obviously collects a lot of data, started reeling off all the different data that they had, and just makes the process inconsistent, because now for every athlete you're looking at different data in a different sequence that takes the conversation down a different route, and it means that if you had to make that same decision again, you can't replicate that process because it's been so organic in the way that it's been set up, and you really want to control that a little bit more. And probably just the two final things that are worthwhile for people to be aware of, and we see very few people ever doing this, but it's really important, is that when new information is introduced, let's say it's a new type of data you're collecting, you might have some new technology, or it's a piece of information that you wouldn't typically look at, but for whatever reason somebody's decided to bring it up, is how you weight that data point against other information you have. When I talk about weighting, I mean like numerical weighting.
Yeah.
So conventionally within sport, a lot of decision making is around, I think it's really important, but it's a little bit woolly for my liking, which is reflection and judgment, and it's really hard to quantify. I'm like quite a big quantitative type person. I want to be able to measure those things like mathematically, numerically, and I like us being able to put numerical weightings on the importance or our confidence in bits of data. So as an example, GPS might be a very well established technology. It's got very good reliability within a device and between a device. We've done our own in-house testing. I'm confident that what that piece of information shows, I can trust that. Okay, we've got this new bit of technology that we've just bought in. There's not the same amount of academic research done on it. We've not done our own in-house testing. I'm maybe going to weight that maybe a 6 out of 10 for my confidence in it, but the GPS may be up about a 9.5. And I might have some subjective data from an athlete that they say their energy on the day. Are they familiar with the scoring tool that we've given them? Like, are they 17 or are they 37? Have they used this a lot? Do they really know how their body feels? I'm gonna want us to give a numerical confidence in that data. These are sort of common things that we see a lot in meetings when things are introduced or when people are making decisions, and they don't consider their confidence in those different pieces of information.
There is so much to unpack there, and I'm going to jump on a couple of aspects just initially. Okay. And this is more around clarifying my own understanding as well. When you talk about contamination, how does that differ from groupthink, like who speaks first and hierarchy? Are they completely different in terms of decision making?
So I think a lot of these concepts, the science will look at them in extreme as that as a defined characteristic or concept that exists. I think what's important for us in sport is that we don't need to know all about all those things, but we do need to know about the tools to mitigate against them. And most of the tools are like broad stroke tools. They address lots of things, but there is a difference. There is a difference between contamination. That would be you and I both initially independently hold different views and things because we have been on different career trajectories. We've got access to different pieces of information. So then if we could set up a way for us to independently feed into that decision to begin with, that would be true independence and true diversity that feeds into that. But let's say you're much more experienced than me for whatever reason, particularly in the domain that we're talking about, and then beforehand we start speaking. and you say some things that I haven't thought about, and I go, Nicola's really experienced, she knows a lot about this, this is her area as well. All of a sudden then I just start agreeing. So you've contaminated my thinking.
Yeah, okay,
Yeah.
get it.
Whereas groupthink, although really similar, so you might afterwards say, oh, you've created groupthink because of that. Whereas groupthink is more that if you're to make a decision about something and the overall group have all similar philosophies, they have access to the same information, they have the same beliefs, embedded beliefs about performance, and you've employed people that really you want them to agree with you, those people are then going to not be able to consider all these different perspectives, and more often than not, they're all going to consensus seek around the same problem-solving solutions to the problem, and then what they decide to actually do off the back of that.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then one other one, you talked about you don't want consensus. I'm going to make the assumption it's not as straightforward as the flip side of that is that you want conflict, but there is a degree that we know that healthy conflict actually, like, and even if you put it from the point of view of a cultural element of psychological safety isn't comfort, like, and consensus. It's an ability to have healthy conflict and not agree with each other, not try to create a likable environment, but a healthy environment to kind of move forward. So I suppose my kind of main question is, you don't want consensus, but as I say, I'm assuming that it's not as simple as you want conflict either.
No, it's not. And I should say that, and I think this is a really important point, that decision making is and I believe a really important point, one of definitely the most important things that we do in performance sport. But there's other things that enable effective decision making that my research hasn't touched on. So psychological safety is one of them, that if you can have high psychological safety, it probably enables your team, your MDT, to make more effective decisions. Although I'm not specifically aware of the research on that, I've not looked into that. But I think we can probably make an assumption that, yeah, if you've got good psychological safety in place, it allows you to do these other things, it enables them to be at a higher level. But specifically on that consensus seeking, here's the issue with consensus seeking, and I use this example quite a lot. Imagine you just have a group of four people that have got to make a decision on whatever it is, athlete availability, or what the goal is going to be for an athlete in a training phase, or selection policies, selecting athletes for whatever it is. You can end up with a situation where two people think you should go with option A and two people think you should go with option B. And now you've got a stalemate. Whereas one of the really prominent features of good decision makers is that they're able to think of things in terms of probabilities and not absolutes. So they start putting probabilities against things, and this is one of the things we deliver training on, and it's one of the first tools that we really go to in our toolboxes, to just start thinking about, if we were to do option A, how confident am I that we would get the outcomes that we want, however you define whatever those outcomes are. And then, okay, and if I think about option B, how confident am I that option B would be the best for getting those outcomes? And if those four people did that independently, meaning that the first person, they think about that and do it by themselves, and then the second person does it, and then 3 and 4. If you were to then simply find the average of those two, you'd find that although 2 might disagree and 2 might agree, or 2 might think option A is better, 2 might think option B, you're probably going to get a difference in the probabilities for how successful they think those things are. And this has been shown across so many different types of decisions, domains, group sizes, complexity of problems, like every kind of type of decision you're making. Thinking in probabilities and putting numerical confidence against things will be much more effective than thinking of things in terms of consensus. And one of just the simple reasons for it is that, let's say you're deciding if you should do A or B. The two people that are disagreeing might only be slightly disagreeing, so they might go, I'm sort of 45% for this one, 55% for this one. But the two people that are agreeing, they might be, 95% on this option and 0% on this one, because they've got much better domain knowledge or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And then when you put the probabilities next to them, you end up with a of a 50-80 difference, but you don't get that when you think of consensus. So for people listening, I think if you can start putting numerical probabilities on, or confidence on, oh yeah, I think this is the best option, or I think if I do this, I'm 95% confident, or I'm 70% confident I'll get this outcome, it allows you to create a feedback loop then to go, oh, I was right, or I got the outcome that I wanted, oh, that was good, or I didn't, oh, I was a little bit overconfident, or maybe underconfident.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and it links into I think the work that you also talk about around calibration. So being calibration and confidence, and also being knowledgeable, but also compared to being accurate. Do you want to explain a little bit about that distinction?
Yeah, sure. So we think of decision making as just a skill, but you can decompose that into multiple skills, and one of the skills is what we call calibration. And calibration is really around how well your subjective confidences match reality. So if you say that you're 80% confident that making this decision is the best option, you should probably be right about 80% of the time. Or if you think that I'm 60% confident that doing this will decrease pain tomorrow, you should be right about 60% of the time, and you should be wrong about 40% of the time. Now, I've got about 150 data points, so individual different people that have done this in sport, and although it changes all the time, what we typically find is that people are quite well calibrated at the lower confidence levels. So when they're sort of 50% confident, 60 or 70, they kind of match reality for most people okay. When we start getting up into these higher confidences, which when people say, I'm 90% confident or I'm 100% confident, we're much less accurate. So the sort of take-home message for people in that is that, you should be, particularly if you're making a decision by yourself, and where possible, if you can make decisions with at least one other person, you're more often than not, particularly across a series of decisions, going to get better outcomes if you can make them with people. But particularly if you're making them on your own and you don't have other people, if you're super confident, you're up at 90, 100% or something, you should have a little warning bell going off in your ear going, oh yeah, I remember actually, typically when people in sport are about 90%, they're correct about 54% of the time. Maybe that's my trigger in my decision-making process to now go speak to somebody else, or to start asking myself, right, or telling myself, I'm definitely wrong now. I'm going to play a little scenario in my head. I'm definitely wrong. What other alternatives can I do? And just related to that then, that you get calibration at the individual level of a person, but you also get calibration at the team level. And as I said, we try to, where there's sufficient time and you've got the resources available and it's a high enough stakes decision, you should be trying to rely on a team of people to make a decision. And if you can get them to independently think about how confident they are in either different options, or for example, if an athlete's fully training, if they're modified, or if they're not training tomorrow, if you can get them to put their confidence in those things and average them together, you can get a much more accurate decision, particularly across a series of decisions. And that's how tournaments are won, seasons are won. So if you can do that and find a way to fit that into your process, you're onto a winner.
That's a great practical kind of takeaway for people as well. There's a big element, or like not an elephant in the room, but the observation is that we don't live in a black and white world. There is rarely like a right or wrong, especially when it comes to human performance and people. We're dealing with complex individuals as well. I talk about it as like embracing the grey. Like it's okay to know that there is uncertainty and to get comfortable with that uncertainty. And as you say, people want confidence, they want clarity, it makes them feel safe. You can then dip into your kind of pattern recognition and different ways of making decisions, but that's often like a false comfort, I would say. Yeah. We've talked about some of those alternatives that people could use. Are there any others that you would allude to around how to kind of embrace uncertainty and definitely the like uncertain world that we live in as well?
Yeah, definitely. So I suppose there's a whole suite of things that people people can do. Some have really strong evidence, some of them have less evidence, but just because they don't have that doesn't mean it's not going to come. But I think one of the first things people can do, if and I hope if they're listening to this, they're thinking, oh yeah, there's maybe a gap in our decision making, or do you know, Alan's saying that not a lot of people are doing this. This is a real competitive advantage for us if we start jumping onto this. So I think decision making education is a really important thing. Just the level of the baseline level of that in sports not particularly high. So getting your staff, getting yourself educated on the types of decisions that we're making, how cognitively we go through making decisions, and then being able to see the difference between, and a lot of this comes from the Good Judgement Project. Here's the characteristics or features of the individuals and the environments that make really effective decisions over a series or forecasts over a series, and then here's the ones that this is maybe what we want to guard against. But usually when we start with people, we get them to map out their decision environment, and there's various ways you can do this. You can do it, which my sort of favourite is by complexity. So what are your simple decisions? What are your complicated decisions? What are your complex? And then what are the decisions that are made in chaos? And then the time you have available under normal conditions to make that decision. And if you can start mapping those things out, one, it gives you really good awareness as to, okay, here's all the different types of decisions that we are making. And then you can start plugging in the correct decision-making tools to them. So if you've got a simpler, complicated decision where there's an awful lot of research, experts would typically agree, there's huge asymmetry if you get it wrong, so things like concussion. There's policies that are written so that under those stressful situations, people can plug and play what those things are. But then you get your much more nuanced, we've lost that match and now we're into, the sort of repechage type stages. That means we've got to fly to this country, so we're going to be jet lagged. What day should we travel on? What day should we do our first training session on? What should the intensity of that be? Or we're working with combat athletes, they've got to make weight, or we're working with collision athletes. Okay, there's going to be pressure changes in the cabin. How's that going to affect muscle damage? These are you don't have a research paper on that. But if you can start mapping them out and understanding those different decisions, you can go, right, for this type of approach, we need to come up with different solutions. We need diversity of input. We need to think about our options in terms of probabilities. We can maybe use a wisdom of the crowd. We can maybe use what's called a pre-mortem, which is we run through a scenario. We use it relies on a sort of psychological feature called prospective hindsight, which is, and this is by a lot of the work on this is by a researcher called Gary Klein, where if you say what's going to go wrong, or we've lost what's gone wrong, and you feed forward, you end up generating less granular problems or issues because you're looking forward at it. Whereas if you create yourself in a situation where you say, we're sitting in the change room, we've just been, thumped, that's us completely out of the tournament. Our top player, they're injured. What has gone wrong? What's happened? When you put yourself in that realistic situation, typically you'll find that between sort of 20 and 40% more granular, more specific issues. So if you've got the time available, doing that for your simple problems that have got good academic research, in my opinion, probably a waste of time because you've got well-researched guidelines. If you go against them,
yeah. You were just wrong. Yeah.
Yeah. Whereas for these complex, one-of-a-kind, really novel types of situations, using your wisdom of the crowd, using your pre-mortem is a much better way to go. But you need to map out your decisions first to understand where those different decisions sit.
Okay, that's really useful. The other aspect that I think is important to kind of, I suppose, highlight is you talked about kind of data and sports tech. We've gone through, I think, 3 different phases. We've had the point where you wanted more data, great. Then we've got all this data, great, but it's not really solved the problem we thought about. And then there's what do we do with that data? What decisions get made? But there's definitely now this, how do people work with the data? How do people work with the technology? How do they make decisions around the data that is available? And how do you relate that to, I suppose, some of this theory? And I haven't actually asked you on this, like how old is it? Like tech has moved so quickly. How does the theory and the research now keep up with, because some of those aspects you talked about, there of the nuance of a context where you're on a plane, you're thinking about cabin pressure, jet lag, like tech can help us with that, but there still needs to be the human in the loop. So how does the human and the tech now integrate together?
Well, I mean, there's about 1,000 sport-specific PhD opportunities in this, because data by itself is like a humongous area. Data in decision making is also a huge area. But this is where we can like lean on a lot of different pieces of research in different areas to sort of help us come to an approach. And then probably I think the most valuable thing about the way we approach decision making and trying to frame all of our decisions as forecasts about the future. And of course, if you can more accurately forecast the future, then you can make better decisions over time, because you know what's more likely to happen. And if you score your decisions, then that allows you to see if the process you're following is getting better over time. But I think particularly in the data world, you know, one of the things that we don't really see people using data for, which is, you know, it's one of these pillars of there's a decision making approach called outside to inside thinking, and what it means is you should take your what we would call base rate or normative data or comparison class data from a bigger data sample to answer the relatively simple question, what typically happens in situations like this? This is before you consider any of the nuanced, case-specific, you know, information that you have. It's just what does the data say situations like this will typically happen, and you anchor your initial your decision or your confidence in what you should do on that, and you should put like a probability on that okay, this is what we can typically expect to happen if we do X, Y, or Z. Right, X has got the best probability. We're going to go with this. But then you adjust that based on that inside nuance information. So, you know, the age of an athlete, or, you know, if it's in Edinburgh where I am, when I worked with Scottish Rugby, sometimes we would train on the 3G pitch, sometimes on the 4G pitch, sometimes we'd have to then drive up to the other pitch because those ones were frosty, and, you know, you're changing surfaces the whole time. So, okay, right, what does that say for about training load? So then you need to lean on the wisdom of the crowd to then adjust that. But one of the things that I've and I definitely credit like my supervisor John Kiley in this, is there's so many embedded beliefs that we just believe in sport that when you really interrogate them, you're like, why do we think that? There's really no evidence there. And one of them is that more data equals better decisions, and it's not that anybody's explicitly said that, but it's just implied, because tech companies, people are just giving us more and more data the whole time. But there's actually really strong evidence that shows the complete opposite. So like just one study off the top of my head that I can remember is there's been a study in bookmakers, so bookies on like horse races and dog races, where they give them different amounts of data to see if more data allows them to make more accurate forecasts. I think they gave them like maybe 5 data points, 10, 20 and 40. And they top out at 5 data points, which means that the value of information is really valuable at 5, and it just becomes decreasingly important as they end up getting more and more data points. But what's really interesting with that is that when you give people more data, their accuracy ends up splitting off from their calibration, their confidence, because people want to find more data. They ultimately find more data that proves their point, and they get more confident, but they don't get more accurate. So this is where I think it's, when we observe this all the time, it's one of the processes we go through with people, is that when you're coming to whatever decision-making meeting it is, whether it's an evening meeting for athlete availability, a morning meeting, a selection meeting, whatever it is, you need to agree in advance what the criteria is of what data you're actually going to look at. Because if not, when somebody throws a new data point in, there's that embedded assumption that this extra data point is going to be really useful to help us confirm our decision. But the evidence would show probably isn't. And it's only once you then come to that, you know, decision that we think this is what we're going to do, should you then do the next bit of it, which is, does anybody have any data that would cause us to change our mind? Does anybody have anything that would completely disprove what we're thinking and tip on its head? That's a much more valuable, time efficient, resource efficient process to go through. But like, certainly, like, we were in a meeting a couple of weeks ago, and one of the practitioners decided to pull out skinfold numbers, and it was, we were kind of a bit taken aback going, how does this relate to like availability for the next day's training? But for them it was really important. But then it became this other discussion point that then the discussion went on and on and on, which you might go, oh, that might have been really valuable, or the discussion was maybe needed for that athlete. But then that happened for so many different athletes that the meeting just went on and on and on. And before the end of it, you could tell other practitioners were going, I'm just going to keep my mouth shut because we need to end this meeting now. So yeah, I think that just embedded assumption that more data is better. Actually, there's evidence that shows the opposite of that, and even there's evidence that's showing the more data you collect, the more your confidence grows, but your accuracy doesn't really grow.
Yeah, it's so interesting because, yeah, as you say, there's a lot of assumptions that get made, or when you were talking about like kind of dominant personalities or people in the room, if that person was the one that is throwing in a new data point, it may not get shut down straight away like it probably should do, and therefore it completely derails the whole purpose, but I suppose outcome of the meeting as well.
100%.
We've touched on slightly, but I do want to, because I think it's really important around this forecasting. Like, I start to think of this as how tech can help with simulations and different scenarios, because we're trying to, we know that it can't be purely like a judgment on a gut feeling or past experience, because we know that that's not accurate. Do you see that as a role that tech can play in the future of helping advance, or at least assist judgment forecasting?
Yeah, in fact, we've just submitted a paper for publication looking at how people are using your classic like large language models to help them specifically in decision making. And so we looked at traditional decision making research and what the tools are available, and if people are using AI as almost another informed practitioner. And for the most part, they're not. They're using it for other things which are really important. So, being able to get base rate information really quickly, that's an important one, because you can do a search. As long as you prompt the large language model really well, you can get it to cite its resources and those sort of things. You can get it to help you with a pre-mortem. You can get it to play a devil's advocate. So I think technology has I think particularly AI is now, it's such a commodity and it's really cheap for people that you should be using it or thinking about how to use this to inform your decision making. The things that large language models, and I know like one of the organizations that do this incredibly well, they pull in all of your data into a large language model, and it now analyzes it and gives recommendations. Some of those recommendations use really good decision making principles around how it feedbacks things in terms of probabilities, and is really clear on the biases. But the things that large language models in particular, and AI is really good for, is processing huge amounts of data and looking for patterns or trends. It can do that much more effectively than people. Mm-hmm. What people are still the best at is being able to, or when they're trained, so not just anybody, when they're trained, what they're better at is being able to understand the information that's not gone into, that isn't in the data that's collected. So, conversations that are had, slight changes in movement that might not be captured because of the technology that you have. If it's in rugby, you maybe have two of your number 9s are injured, which means that the number 9 that's back on is going to be doing a huge amount more of the exercises. That's not going to be captured the same in the large language model at the moment. So then you still need the human judgment. And I would say there's some really interesting research from a whole bunch of different domains. One of them is like in accountancy, where we tend to think that data is objective, and then we tend to think that we are really subjective. But actually, data is as biased as you are. for the sheer matter of fact that you're deciding what metrics to look at.
Yeah.
Which means that you've either read something or somebody's told you something, or for whatever reason you've decided that those are the important metrics. Maybe there's research behind them, but that doesn't mean that that's a really important metric. It just means that, or it might mean that research hasn't been done on other metrics, or is not being compared against other things yet, but we think we're being objective. And the other point about this is that data is what it is. But like, for example, in accounting and auditing, they've shown this, that you can show accountants the exact same data, and it is what it is. It's very much binary, that this is like the tax due on something, and you'll get 100 different calculations for what the tax should be based on the interpretation of that from the accountants. And it's the same in like stock trading, that all these big firms, JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs and Barclays, they all have access to the same data, but yet they're all taking the opposite sides of trades, otherwise you wouldn't have a market.
Yeah.
The data is just showing what the data is showing, but it's the analyst's interpretation of that data, their biases of the internal data, the experience that they've stored, which is flawed, it's incomplete. All of those things then go into how they interpret that number. And I don't think in sport we've really quite cracked that yet, because we think, for whatever reason, oh yeah, the data's objective. If it says training load is this, our policy is that we do this. And actually, if there's anything that's come out of this research study that we've just done, is that almost unanimously people feel that with the advent of AI and more data than ever, actually we need to have better decision-making skills to be able to make more effective decisions and navigate that more information.
And I'm pretty sure it's noise, and that book makes it really clear from even a legal judgment perspective, the decisions that are made pre-lunch when you're hungry compared to after lunch when you're, and if you factor that into kind of like sport and performance, where you've got weekends or people are emotionally tired because they're away from family for longer periods of time, like that's all going to definitely have an influence, as you say, subjectively, but on the objective data, because of either how it's tested or how it's interpreted or what we've even done today. So just because it is a number and quantitative doesn't mean it's completely objective.
So sure, like totally, completely agree.
If you've studied lots of decision making, you've looked at that in different environments, what if there was one question that you asked people to go away to think about, and this is for those who are practitioners using tech and in sport, and those that are building it as well, because we know some of these listeners have an entrepreneurial desire within them. What is it that you would want them to think about as that initial step in decision making?
I think really where this, if we know what good decision making processes look like, so we know that we probably need to anchor decisions in base rates. We probably need to understand that how that's changed based on the inside nuanced information. We want to convert those judgments into probabilities. In that workflow of a decision, if I'm a tech company, and I've seen a little bit of research on this, it's great to have a novel product, and you might think it's valuable in isolation, but really for these companies, I think the key breakthrough bit is where in that workflow and that decision workflow does that fit in? How do you make it as convenient as possible? And I value this massively, is how much weight would you put on that, like as a company, and why? Because just because something isn't really sensitive, or just because it's new, you don't have a lot of information behind, doesn't mean that you can't provide an accurate weighting for it. I think if companies were really forthcoming with that, I think you'd probably get, like, you start getting that systems change in the way that we think about how we use the data, rather than all data is created equally. Like, this is a new tool, it's really useful, but I certainly would be weighing it as high as a force dex or whatnot. So I would definitely sort of push companies. And like, one of the things, it didn't exist in sport. There's, to our knowledge, only one other one available in the world, and it's from a US based company that had nothing to do with sport, to do with, big like international projects. But calibration training and tools to assess that just didn't exist in sport, so we've built our own one. but we're very clear where that sits in. That is it sits at two levels. So I think of the individual practitioner level, the sports science and medicine and coaching team, and then an organisational level. We've pitched ours initially at the individual level and at the sports science and medicine team level, and we see it as a thing that goes in as a upgrading the capabilities of those people. So it doesn't sit specifically within that workflow of do your calibration training and then do this, or it sits much before, and it's a general upgrading your capabilities and your awareness of your calibration, so that when you come to make either decisions on your own or you come to make them as part of a multidisciplinary team, you know how well your confidence matches reality. But we're explicit with that this is where it fits into your workflow.
Yeah, like obviously that as tech develops, that transparency of how it's been built and where it fits, and the thought process that's happened in the R&D before that, you hope people are going to be interrogating that, because then at least they know what impact it could actually make in a performance environment as well.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. Allan, I could talk, and we have done over the last couple of weeks, about these topics for many, many hours with you, but thank you so much for your time. I do have one last kind of question. You've studied how experts make decisions, but also how they get it wrong. How has it changed how you make decisions?
It's really transformative, to be fair, in lots of different ways. I mean, my wife is probably sick of me saying the word decision making, but I mean, I'm trying to think of a relevant example, like, because it feeds into my day job like daily, but in my personal, I suppose a realistic one was when we came to buy our house. We had to make a decision we obviously had to make lots of decisions around how much of our deposit to put down, how big a mortgage and whatnot, but one of the ones that I did, and it's not even complex maths, I did in Excel, did some what's called Monte Carlo simulation, where I just put in what the what the outside view is, what the base rate for inflation numbers are, and what the Bank of England's base rate is for mortgage that's used to set mortgage rates. And then I did forecasting for what I think it's going to be at 2 years, 3 years, or 5 years, or 10 years, so that I could pick which was the best mortgage. And one of the key questions was that when they start cutting it, traditionally what ends up happening, because it had been elevated for such a period of time. But when I ran then a Monte Carlo simulation, for people who don't know it, basically runs you put in some inputs into it, some really simple ones like historic data, maybe 5 or 10 different bits of information, and it runs this scenario in a theoretical world the number of times you ask it. So I asked it for 10,000 times is a pretty typical one. But based on that, we were pretty clear that actually if we pay for whatever mortgage product we did, we think at 5 years time we're going to be better off by taking out a 5-year mortgage than the 2 year, the 10 year, because it's too difficult to forecast 10 years in advance.
Yeah.
2 years and 5 years is about that. So my wife was sick of me showing her the numbers to do with that, but that's like a real life situation then, where you're better informed that, all right, I can think this, my dad can say this, my neighbour can say this. Let's just take all of those subjective biases out of it. Let's anchor it in what the data actually shows, and then all these, there's going to be a government change, there's going to be additional whatever. Let's adjust that historic value by there. So, there's a real world example of how I've actually used it to buy my house.
And massive transferable skill from your doctorate. Well, as you say, you're publishing papers related to it, and you are so close to the end of your doctorate in this area, which will be obviously a huge achievement. But thank you so much for your time, Allan. It's hugely valuable for people.
No, thank you for having me on.